All right, we're ready. Let me just say that I will have to slip out in about half hour to catch a flight to The Hague, to Amsterdam, in order to go to The Hague for an event tomorrow that I think I referred to in my opening remarks. It's a new initiative that's being launched on conflict resolution between businesses and communities, which will be headquartered in The Hague, and the kickoff event is tomorrow morning. So I'm going to hand it now back to John, from John to John to John to John, and he will orchestrate traffic for the next discussion. Thank you. Would you like this?
I don't think I want to be using this for the working group at all. Far from it. And very little need to introduce any of the five of you. You're obviously well known now to everybody in the audience. There are a number of questions that I posed to you in advance. I just have to find those now. Yes. We asked you, the five of you, to reflect on the particular challenges that stand out in your minds, which were identified in the forum discussions over the past 2 days. We also asked you to think about what priorities you think stakeholders need to give attention to in the coming year, and are there any that the working group itself might like to take a leadership position on. And the last point here is the working group might also want to frame up some ways the next forum could be improved, built on, and we'd appreciate any reflections from any of the five of you on that issue too. And I think we've agreed an order, and Pavel, I think you're first. Is that okay? Thank you.
Добрый вечер.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, John. My dear colleagues, my dear friends. The indigenous peoples often say, when in a particular forum an issue is being considered, they get the floor last. Everyone's already trying to leave, they're already going out the door. We get to speak last because you always have dessert last, and that's the most tasty part of the meal. So I'm grateful to my colleagues that they have decided to give me the floor first as a kind of the appetizer. Anyway, thank you very much for making me the appetizer. Back in 2002, in this very room, I spoke addressing the forum on the rights of indigenous peoples, the Indigenous Forum. I was sitting somewhere in the room at the time, and it was in July 2002 when I made my statement. I declared that I would never sit down at the negotiating table with industrial companies. Although I understand that negotiations are necessary, but I believed at that time that negotiations with an industrial enterprise would be a matter for the next generation of leaders of indigenous peoples. Now, that was back in 2002. But already in 2005, I was one of the first leaders of indigenous peoples in Russia who signed an agreement with one of the largest companies of the Russian Federation, a treaty on cooperation and mutual understanding. In 2006, I also facilitated the negotiating process on Sakhalin with indigenous peoples and one of the largest transnational corporations. Now, why am I recalling all this? Because, to my great regret, what I have heard over the past few days from the participants in the work of our forum, which makes first and foremost the indigenous peoples, what I've heard over the past few days is the situation is changing very slowly. The rights of indigenous peoples have been violated and are continuing to be violated. To my huge regret, we have heard of cases where, in defense of their rights, people lose their lives or are arrested. But also from my own personal experience, I can say that things are changing, albeit very slowly. I believe that, in actual fact, the work that's been done by John Ruggie, that we respect so greatly, with his team, is unique and vastly important. I would like to once again express tremendous appreciation to him on behalf of indigenous peoples, because the guiding principles he developed are not part of the system for the protection of indigenous rights directly. They're not an integral part of the protection of the rights of indigenous peoples, but nevertheless, these guiding principles are one of the pillars that indigenous people can use to protect their rights. The guiding principles create new opportunities for defending the rights of indigenous peoples. Our working group, which is being created now and has started its work, is another forum where indigenous peoples can exchange views, not just amongst themselves, but also with representatives of state and business, in order to find together ways to solve the problems that arise. And for my part, I wanted to say that I am extremely appreciative to my colleagues for the fact that indigenous peoples are going to be, throughout the mandate of the existence of our group, is going to be one of the priorities of the group. Here, my brothers, Chief Littlechild, and others have quite rightly said that we are not a marginalized group. We're not the only group at special risk, although, of course, that is true. But first and foremost, we are rights holders. And for that reason, our working group has not just declared that the indigenous people are going to be one of its priorities in its work, but at the last session, in fact, which was held last week, the working group there decided, Willie already mentioned this, that we will prepare a special report to the General Assembly on Indigenous Peoples and Business. Moreover, at our last session, we also met with Willie as a leader from the expert mechanism, and we said that we'll work side by side, shoulder to shoulder, working together in defense of the human rights of and the rights of indigenous peoples. Also, before our forum, we met with representatives of indigenous peoples. Members of our working group met with peer representatives of indigenous peoples, and we decided that we will make such meetings a standing feature of our work before the forum, a permanent feature of our work. And a final point. I should like very strongly to support John Ruggie when he says, and he mentioned this today, when he said today that the time has come for action. The time for talking, studying, and writing is now over. Of course, we'll continue to study, to talk, to write, but the time has moved on from that to the time for action. And I think that's why we all together with all of those here, with the states, with the business sector, with the representatives of civil society, we must all act together. The time is for action. Once again, I would like to emphasize, addressing in particular representatives of the business sector, that we have no choice but to cooperate. We all live in the same planet. We all live in the same Mother Earth. And in principle, nothing should divide us. We have different interests. We have different approaches. Sometimes those are mutually exclusive approaches and interests. But I would emphasize once again, we have no choice but to work together. And that's why I very much hope that in coming years, our work will be productive and will achieve tangible results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pavel. I go straight to Margaret now. I think you're the next.
Okay, thank you, John. But I'd like to first start by thanking everybody who came to the forum and contributed so much to the valuable discussions. I feel like right now I'm quite challenged to reflect on what I heard. I feel like I need to digest it for a few more weeks before I reflect before I reflect back. So what I'm giving you now are some really initial thoughts on what I heard. And I should frame these too by saying, you know, given that we had parallel tracks going through the annual forum, that we had to make a choice in terms of which tracks we attended. So I ended up going to most of the tracks that related to Pillar 2 around the company responsibility to respect human rights, and also those that related to companies as an actor group. So most of my reflections will be within that realm. And even within that narrow realm, the reflections were so rich, I felt that I had to categorize in order to catch most of them. So when I'm reflecting back, I'll first start with some reflections on the micro level, so things that are happening within the company itself. And then I'll move on to the meso level or the mid-level, so things that are happening across the business community, some of the challenges we're experiencing and what we should do going forward. And then finally, I'll go to the macro level, so the whole question of business as an activity and how that relates to human rights. So first, the micro level within the individual company. You know, I heard companies grappling with some incredibly difficult challenges over the last 2 days. Some of the challenges around how you get human rights into supply chains which can be incredibly complex and have 50,000 entities through which you have only varying degrees of control and foreseeability over what's happening. I mean, Orat from the Fair Labor Association mentioned too that we have these wider systemic problems around the supply chain as well. We also had some discussions around how we get human rights across mainstreamed across different departments in the company, because of course you have to engage with human resources department and land management department and research and marketing. So, you know, human rights will cut across many different departments, sometimes departments which have conflicting or competing agendas. So there's also a cultural thing within the company to get past when you're trying to roll human rights out. We had some very good discussions around how you engage civil society organizations and communities and how you get that safe space within those to actually productively move forward. So there's lots of challenges to be brief, but yeah, it's natural and expected that we have those challenges. You know, given that we are now at the stage of taking the guiding principles from that agreement on paper into something in practice in an individual company, we're now at that level of thinking about how we get it into operational systems and practices at the individual company level. And I think one person put it perfectly in one of the sessions. He said, you know, there are good problems to have and there are bad problems to have. It's a good problem to have a flat tire on your Ferrari. And in a way, it's a good problem that we are grappling with how we get human rights mainstreamed into company systems and cultures. It shows exactly where we are now in terms of the developments of the human rights and business field, how far we've come with the guiding principles. Now, in terms of what we need to think about going forward at this micro level within an individual company context, and I think, you know, this is what we need to think about both as a UN working group, but as well as all actors in the human rights and business field. I think we need to think about how we can scale up these efforts and ramp them up very quickly. How we can make sure that they feed into each other so that the learning from one effort is carried over into another and in as much of a multi-stakeholder way as possible. And we need to think about how we should not overcomplicate some of this. And by that, I mean, you know, some of the discussions we referred to were about how you get from point A to point B as quickly as you can within a company. And sometimes this means piggybacking human rights into pre-existing systems in the company. You know, so using some of the risk management systems or the health, safety, and environmental systems within the company and importing human rights into those so you can get quick wins. Okay, now moving on to the mezzo or the mid-level, so dealing with businesses as a community of actors and how that relates to the guiding principles. The first session on Tuesday in relation to Pillar 2, we had an interesting discussion on the various factors that actually drove companies to consider the guiding principles and human rights. And those factors ranged across law and regulation, investors' requirements, enlightened CEOs, media stories that threatened reputational damage to companies, consumers and their expectations and demands on companies, big companies pushing human rights requirements through to other companies in their supply chains, NGOs and communities demanding their rights, industry groups exerting peer pressures, and you know, the list goes on. And all of these factors can and do push companies to consider human rights. But not all of these forces are equal, and not all apply to all companies all the time. So we still have state-owned enterprises or small generic brand companies that fly underneath the radar, or companies that sell business to business rather than business to consumer, that are under a different set of pressures. And this is something we need to be conscious about as we move the human rights and business field forward. We need to ensure that all the different pressure points, and there are many that we can tap into here, we need to ensure that they're hitting across a variety of different actors and not overwhelmingly focused on one or two types of actors in the business community. And finally, let me turn to the macro level. So looking at that broader activity of business and how that relates to society. You know, it seems, you know, through many discussions, not only within the sessions, but also in the hallways over the far too infrequent coffee breaks that we had, it seems that our world is really struggling with the concept of, you know, what is the role of business in relation to society? As an extension of being the very engine room of society and promoting growth. And, you know, I'm not going to pretend that this is a new question, because everybody from Karl Marx to Milton Friedman has grappled with this one. But I will say that it's new in that it has now reached, you know, Joe and Jane in the street to become a pressing concern of theirs. And this is Joe and Jane in the street who buy the company's products and who work for the company, or who pitch up a tent in Occupy Wall Street and protest against the company. And now, to address this, a number of different initiatives and movements have started around corporate social responsibility or corporate ethics or sustainability. And they've given rise to a number of different principles and codes, you know, ranging from the high level, like the Global Compact or the OECD guidelines, to the very industry-specific, like PRI or EITI, and then also to the company level. There are hundreds of individual company codes of conduct and statement of principles. And a number of companies have mentioned the challenge of navigating within this landscape of many different codes and principles. And, you know, I'm sympathetic to that, but I think this is an area where we, and again, I'm speaking of we in terms of the human rights and business movement as a whole, in addition to just the UN Working Group. This is an area where we need to get a really quick win and move in fast. Because this is an area where the guiding principles set their really clear value added. Okay, 1 minute. You know, with the guiding principles, they set that minimum bottom line for companies to do no harm, to respect human rights. And they allow companies to go above that bar and you know, to build hospitals and schools, but they do set that very clear bar on responsibilities. And it's something that many of these other initiatives and CSR concepts fail to do. And it's that very clear line that companies need in order to operate. So in terms of moving forward, I think we need to get very clear and aggressive about messaging this, about what the guiding principles do bring in terms of clarity to the business community. And in that way, companies aren't going to suffer as well from this fatigue of multiple codes and guidelines. John, if I could just have 1 more minute to discuss the dissemination challenge and to conclude my observations on business as an actor, because we've discussed a lot the importance of dissemination over the last 2 days. And the UN Working Group has a train theory on dissemination. And that is that, you know, Just like not all cars in a train are equal, there's an engine car that pulls the other cars along. Not all in this dissemination process are equal. There will be businesses that pull other businesses along. They'll pull them along through their global supply chains or through raising pressure among industry peers and through raising expectations or simply showing in public that this can be done and how. So you companies that have been with us over the last 2 days, you know, I recognize by virtue of the fact that you're here, you are probably part of that engine moving us forward. And I want to thank you for playing that critical role. But I also want to encourage you to play that engine role going forward. And in the next year, I want you to pull some of your business colleagues to this annual forum as well, so that we get more horsepower next year coming from the business side in grappling with some of these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. We'll move straight on to Michael now.
Right, thank you, John. It was a very deliberate decision of the working group for the chair of the working group to say a long list of thank yous at the very early or the very first session, which I think he did admirably. This is the time to affirm that gratitude to everybody who has participated, but especially immense gratitude to John Raggi for setting such an excellent foundation that we could actually build on. Now, as Margaret quite rightly pointed out, we couldn't be in all places at once, and so I ended up following the panels that related to state implementation. Now, it seems rather odd that in those sessions, most of the states didn't seem to canvass their own challenges, and the challenges that seemed to emerge were requests and suggestions from other stakeholders. Now, it also seemed quite clear that some of the challenges that have come up are very related to the priorities that have been identified. So the concepts are very, very similar. One of those challenges that seemed to emerge, particularly for states, was that low level of awareness of the guiding principles. The idea, of course, seems to suggest that everybody has a responsibility, and everybody, meaning businesses, civil society, and states, have a responsibility to, in effect, disseminate. But actually, the large and primary responsibility seems to lie on states. Because, after all, if states are to be able to implement Pillar 1, they're going to they have to increase the level of knowledge of the guiding principles. Now, it's from this context that suggestions from certain constituencies for states to take account of national action plans comes in very, very relevant. And it's out of the national action plans that states can actually craft mechanisms, strategies, and ways of disseminating and making constituencies aware of the GPs and subsequently strategies for implementation. One other challenge that seemed to emerge, of course, was request for a strong and clear regulatory framework, a regulatory framework that takes account of the GPs. Now, this emerged especially clearly in the panels relating to due diligence, because it's out of these regulatory frameworks that you can actually incorporate the due diligence requirement. But more importantly is the idea that if you have a very clear regulatory framework, you can actually respond to the requests from businesses for a level playing field. Now, the question, of course, then arose as to whether this requires a reinvention of existing strategies or creating new ones. And we had some panels which came up with excellent suggestions, some of which have already been canvassed, of using existing transparency and reporting mechanisms as a way of building capacity and strength in the regulatory framework, which I find very, very attractive. Another of those challenges that put to states, of course, is the request to strengthen access to justice. And of course, access to justice takes a whole variety of forms, including internal access to justice, which of course could include judicial access to justice and non-judicial access to justice, but also external, or the recurrent theme of extraterritorial access to justice. And of course, it has been mentioned a number of times how complex that subject is, how contentious that subject is, but as John Raggi keeps reminding us, there is no specific barrier to an individual state designing its own strategies for dealing with this matter. So, of course, the question does arise for individual states at this stage to consider how to strengthen their own mechanisms. But I'm sure they can start with internal mechanisms, but especially internal judicial mechanisms. And that may very well require mechanisms for dissemination of the guiding principles among judicial authorities as well as legislators. Now, of course, the question then arises as to what priorities should we lay or do we recognize for states? Well, it occurs to me that all three pillars are equal. They are complementary but different. But I also can, feel strongly that Pillar 1, the state's duty to protect, is one upon which the other two will probably build beautifully. And if that's going to be effective, then states will have to assume some kind of leadership. Leadership in terms of all aspects of implementation, all aspects of dissemination, and all aspects of access to justice. And it's that leadership that is probably states can actually begin to assume at this stage. Finally, I want to mention the whole idea of cooperation between states. Cooperation at the intergovernmental level, cooperation across regional groups, cooperation within regional groups seems to me a good opportunity or a priority issue for sharing good practice and lessons learned to be able to take the guiding principles forward. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. You've given Alexander 2 extra minutes, if you want them, Alex.
Muy bien. Mil gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for participating in this forum. We know that many of you have come from afar, and we appreciate your presence here. I wanted to highlight something that may seem obvious, but I think sometimes we lose sight of it in our discussions. And that is, in order to have this conversation, we need to include civil society, we need to include businesses, and we need to include states. We need to have an inclusive conversation. It must also be balanced. The privilege that the working group has is that we all have a range of expertise, but our privileged stance, our privileged position is that we are able to engage in this type of balanced discussion, and that is our role. Our role is to see how the different pieces of the system fit together. There is no one single solution to the issue of business conduct. There are a range of measures, complementary measures, that need to be established. So I simply wanted to draw your attention to that. I don't think we should forget that as we move forward. Some of the challenges and priorities that I have identified, I don't want to be repetitive here. I certainly endorse what the other members of the panel have said. This forum has focused on concrete examples of the implementation of the guiding principles. And this is significant because they will take on more significance as they are implemented in a concrete fashion. So how these can affect individuals, I think, is something that we have taken up in our discussions. In that, we have to look at business conduct, how they relate to their employees, their partners, how they conduct risk analysis, risk assessments, as well as the impact of their operations on human rights, as well as their environmental platforms and how those can affect human rights. And that is all well and good. But I believe that what is next, what lies around the corner, is indeed the intersection between the state and enterprise. The guiding principles consist of 3 pillars, as you know. But these pillars should not be disjointed or considered separately. States formulate the way states formulate their position vis-a-vis enterprises will be important. And this, we cannot look at this in a simplistic way. In the past, the word regulation somewhat perturbed enterprises, but now there are many ways in which this can occur. Licenses can be obtained. This is an example of regulation, and this is something that already exists. What we have to understand is that the guiding principles need to be accepted in that context. This cannot become a burden to enterprises either, particularly in the current environment, economic environment, with the economic slowdown. The last thing that we want is to create obstacles to employment and to the generation of income or revenues. Now, looking forward, one of the trends will undoubtedly be the requirement for enterprises to report on how they are complying with the guiding principles. These discussions have many technical components. They will look at how often, in what manner these are being complied with. Discussions will be held with a representative of the stock markets where that company's shares are being traded, with industry representatives, trade union representatives. So all of those partners will be involved in the conversation. We will also be looking at what happens when an enterprise fails to report or when systematic problems occur across an industry. This will indeed be material for our future conversations. Then I think it's clear to all of us that not all violations of human rights can be addressed in the same way. Conflict resolution is indeed desirable, but when that does not work, we need to have other approaches to address the issue of impunity. Serious consequences must be in place so that companies who violate rights are held accountable. So a number of different incentives could be put in place to shape, if you will, the operations of such companies. An agreement should be reached, and this has been mentioned in our discussions, on crimes against humanity and serious human rights violations, as well as the consequences that those actions should have. It is ethically desirable for all business actors to fulfill their obligations, but we need to avoid problems that are larger in scale. And that's why I think we need to have a multi-level approach. And in this context, I think regional organizations and international organizations, other than the United Nations, both government and private entities, can play a role. They are in a unique place to take that type of approach. I believe that we have a golden opportunity here to work with financial organizations, both regional and international. In the IFC and the World Bank, efforts have been made to develop their social safeguards programs and to incorporate human rights elements into those. They have made adjustments to their complaint mechanisms, but these should be disseminated these should be common among other financial entities as well, as part of a larger strategic approach. So international trade unions and industrial and regional associations also play a role. They play an important role in bringing together efforts to avoid disparity or scattering of efforts, and this will only add to coherence overall. Finally, I would like to highlight the importance of information. We need to receive different types of information. And this lies at the heart of the changes that are being made in public policies. So training is needed in the guiding principles. We require information on the efforts being made by states. We need that for two reasons. One, to learn. Many states are doing this, are embarking on these efforts for the first time. So they need to engage in a discussion, and flexible approaches are needed in that context so that they can learn how to perhaps address any issues. Another problem here is an issue here is credibility. Nobody believes that the guiding principles are necessarily a politically viable principle. They're something that has stemmed from a series of conversations and discussions. So these guiding principles need to be credible. And to be credible, they have to have broad-based acceptance. And for that to occur, they need to be proven effective. So this is one of the key points, and it's one of the main reasons why we need more information. Finally, if in terms of fragile situations, transitional justice, conflict situations, these issues were raised by many panelists and participants, and we are well aware that we need to keep working in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'm just about to hand over to Puvan, the chairperson of the working group, who will give his reflections and also formally close the meeting. Just a very brief notice before I do so, to thank the interpreters, and to maybe we should all clap the interpreters. And also to confirm that we will be finishing on time. So, Puvan, the floor's yours.
I've come to the lectern so that there is an appropriate gravitas to the last intervention for this forum. I would like to thank John Morrison for facilitating this last session. What an unprecedented, fantastic 2 days of activity. John Ruggie spoke of this happening being beyond our wildest expectations. The sobering thought is that we only get to say that once. From here on out, we need a new ruler, we need a new set of measures, and fortunately, I think we have recalibrated as a community over the past 2 days. Things cannot and will not be the same. I will mention specifically the point made in the new audiences session. Engaging new audiences on a large scale requires sensitivity to local, historical, social, and political contexts to find the right entry points and levers. And those, I think, who know the GPs understand that they have this sensibility built into them. I think an actor that has been, or that has experienced some shock with these proceedings is the UN. Yet I believe that this forum showcases the best of what the UN offers: an open, objective platform for relevant and urgent and intelligent responses from representatives of a global community of governments, civil society, and business. And on an issue, human rights, that is at the very core of the UN and very naturally championed by the UN. But I also believe that while the UN has brought us here, we need to accept ownership of this forum and the continuing opportunities that it offers as a recurring point in time. What happens next year? What are we collectively going to do to make this a happening next year? One concrete and necessary thing that we've discussed in the working group is to drive the gathering of inputs from regional meetings, which we expect to be held by willing and interested states, associations, and UN agencies throughout next year, before we meet again as a forum in December 2013. Also, the context setting that we had here, for example, at the Indigenous Peoples meeting in the preparatory day before the actual forum, is exactly the type of input that we welcome and would hope to see as a fixture in next year's forum. I mentioned recalibration. There was a comment by a friend at OHCHR that having 1,000 people here is like being at a Lady Gaga concert. Well, you know, get ready for tens of thousands, because that's what happens when things really start to happen. That's when music's taste starts to shift. That's when fashions are created. And that's when we get merchandising. And at that scale, things really start to get interesting. And when the UN starts drawing comparisons with Lady Gaga, that's pretty interesting. But we have some way to go. And if you found value here over the next 2 days, and if you are inspired to go now to do more with friends that you've made here, then I'm confident that we can get that exponential growth in awareness, in implementation, in dissemination of the GPs, which is what we want to see happen. I know that there are many here whose heroism and defense of human rights is a way of life. To those who are newer to this agenda, to this mission, when you have to speak about what happened here and when you have to explain to those colleagues who have no idea who John Ruggie is or what the GPs offer, I ask you to be a hero. Whether you are an NGO or a business or a government, be a hero. You will face doubt and despair. Your peers and colleagues will mock you. They will discourage you. They will disparage you. Your sector will bind you in dogma and statistics on why this is not doable. Cynicism and skepticism will be the excuse for laziness and inaction. Be a hero. Tell them how you reached over fences here, that things actually are different and that we must exploit the opportunity of changing attitudes. Be a hero. This movement, business and human rights, is worth the effort. It's worth the risk. It's worth the investment. It is worth the rewards of dignity, equity, and sustainability that we will share together. Be a hero. Thank you. This meeting is closed.